let's do an example, putting it all together so we can see kind of everything we've learned in chapter 4 in one big problem. So here's our scenario. It says Mrs. Soto asked 7 of her students how many hours they worked last week. Their answers are given here. The first thing that we want to do is create a histogram for the data. So we're going to use our calculator to create that histogram. I'm going to stat, edit. I'm clearing the data that's in there, and I'm going to type in the data given. Once I have that data in there, I need to edit my stat plot to make sure that it is a histogram. So it looks like it's on, which is good. This little bar stuff is my histogram. And then I'm going to go to Zoom 9 to see my histogram. So I'm going to sketch this. Hitting trace allows me to see the beginning and the ending part. So it looks like it starts at 13 and goes to 15.25. I'm not really liking that scale, so I'm going to go to my window. 13 is a good starting point. 24 would be fine to stop. And let's count by 2s instead of 2.25. So it looks like now we're going 13 to 15, and it's up at 3. (15 to 17 had none. 17 to 19 we were at 1. 19 to 21 we're up at 2. 21 to 23, again at 1. Make sure everything is labeled. So these numbers here are referring to how many hours they worked. So I'm going to say hours of work. Vertically, I would be looking at how many students worked that. So maybe just number of students. And then we also need a title, so I'm just going to say students and work. Once we have our histogram, we are then going to move on to part B, which just says to describe the data. Whenever you're asked to describe, I need to talk about SACS, which is shape, outliers, center, and spread. So we're going to start with talking about the shape. Now, this is definitely a weird one. All of the examples we've done so far have been pretty obvious. I don't think that the shape is as obvious on this one. Now, you could argue that things look kind of skewed to the right because maybe you're looking at it as a whole. You could choose to ignore this left-hand side and just look at these kids over here, in which case you would say that the data looks symmetric. It's really up to you as long as you're backing up your information. I'm going to use kind of this idea here that makes it look a little bit skewed. Whenever you are describing the data, please make sure that you are writing this in context of the problem. So I'll say the distribution of how many hours students worked last week appears to be unimodal, one hump. I'm thinking this is definitely the hump right here, and skewed right. So in this sentence, I have introduced what the topic is talking about. I'm looking at how many hours the students worked last week. I've talked about the two important pieces, of socks. Moving on to O, I would then talk about outliers. Now, I don't see anything that looks kind of super crazy. You know, there's no students that worked 50 hours over here. That would be an outlier. I don't see any students that worked 0 hours. That would definitely be an outlier. I'm not seeing any big outliers, but I am noticing that there's a gap. No students worked between 15 and 17 hours. So I'm going to talk about that gap when I talk about my outliers because I do think it is unusual. So I'm going to say, although there do not appear to be any outliers, there is a gap in the data. No students worked between 15 and 17 hours. Okay, now that I've talked about outliers, I'm done there. I'm moving on to center and spread. Your center and spread should always relate back to your shape. So because I'm arguing that this is skewed, if my shape is skewed, then that means my center should be the median and my spread should be the IQR. To find that median and IQR, we're going to go back and use our calculator. When I go to stat, I should already have my data typed in, so I don't need to edit that anymore. We're going to find our 5-number summary by stat calculate, enter for one variable. I'm going to scroll down. Looks like my median is at 18. And my IQR, I would have to find myself by taking Q3 and subtracting Q1. So Q3 is 20, Q1 is 13, 20 minus 13 gives me 7. Now when I go to describe this, I do want to make sure that I'm talking about that 18 and 7 in context of the problem. So this median, 18, is still in the units that we used for our data. So I would say the median number of hours worked is 18 hours, and the IQR is 7 hours. In order to get full credit on a question like this, I want to tell you what you would need. The first thing that you would need is to explain what this distribution is looking at. So in context, you need to somehow introduce that this is talking about how many hours students worked last week. So that's one. The next thing we would look for is the shape. 2 things you need for shape. You need to talk about the number of modes, and then also whether it is skewed or symmetric. You also need to make sure you're talking about outliers. If there's no outliers, then you could talk about gaps. The next thing that we would look for is the center. That center, again, needs to make sure it's in context, so talking about that median, and then also talking about spread. Make sure that you're thinking about the correct center and spread. For example, if you argued that this was a symmetric distribution, then you would not use median and IQR, you would use mean and standard deviation.